The morning sun hung merciless over the Texas plains, its heat already pressing down on the dusty earth like a blacksmith's hammer on iron. Elise Laurent sat on the wooden steps of the ramshackle general store in Dusty Fork, her hands folded primly in her lap despite the chaos that had just torn her world apart. The navy blue traveling dress that had once been her pride, tailored in New Orleans with mother-of-pearl buttons and French lace at the collar, now bore the stains of a 1,000-mile journey and the humiliation of the past hour. She had come so far. The riverboat from New Orleans to Galveston, then the bone-rattling stagecoach across endless miles of scrubland and prairie. Every mile had been fueled by the letters she'd treasured, written in careful script by Samuel Pike, promising her a home, a partnership of minds, a future built on mutual respect and learning. He had written of his love for books, his desire for an educated companion to help civilize the frontier. She had believed every word. But Samuel Pike was dead, had been dead for 3 months, according to his brother Thaddeus, who'd met her at the depot with eyes like chips of flint and a sneer that cut deeper than any blade. "So you're the fancy French girl my fool brother was moon-eyed over," Thaddeus had said, looking her up and down like she was livestock at auction. "Well, ain't you a disappointment? Skinny as a rail, pale as milk, and probably couldn't birth a child if your life depended on it." Elise had tried to explain, her voice trembling but determined. She had education, could read Latin and Greek, could calculate surveying measurements, could teach children. Her father had been a cartographer for the French government before yellow fever took him. She carried his instruments, his maps, his knowledge. Surely that had value. Thaddeus Pike had laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin cup. "Value? Girl, you can't cook, can't sew, can't even milk a cow. I'd wager. What use is book learning to a man trying to carve a living from this godforsaken land?" He gestured to the dusty street with its saloons and gambling halls. "This ain't Paris, sweetheart. This is Texas. And in Texas, a woman's worth is measured by what she can do with her hands, not what's rattling around in her empty head." He'd taken everything then. Her trunk with her father's instruments, the brass compass, the surveying tools, the carefully rolled maps of territories yet to be settled, her small purse with the last of her money, even the daguerreotype of her parents, the only image she had left of them. "Consider it payment for the trouble you've caused," he'd said, loading her belongings onto his wagon. "Samuel spent good money bringing you here, money he owed me. Figure this squares the debt." "But what am I to do?" she had whispered, the reality of her situation settling over her like a burial shroud. "Not my concern." He'd climbed onto his wagon seat, not even bothering to look back. "Maybe try the saloon. Pretty as you are, under all that dirt, I'm sure the boys would find some use for you. Course, you'd have to learn to be a mite more accommodating than you are now." The wagon had rumbled away, leaving her standing in the middle of Main Street with nothing but the clothes on her back and the crushing weight of absolute desolation. Now, as the sun climbed higher and the heat pressed down like a living thing, Elise felt the last of her strength ebbing away. The townspeople of Dusty Fork went about their business, stepping around her as if she were just another piece of frontier debris. A drunk staggered out of Murphy's saloon and leered at her with bloodshot eyes before his companion pulled him away. 2 women in faded calico dresses whispered behind their hands as they passed, their voices carrying words like foreign and uppity and no better than she ought to be. She had no money for food, no place to sleep, no prospects of any kind. The frontier was supposed to be a place where people could start over, where hard work and determination mattered more than bloodlines or bank accounts. But for a woman alone, with no skills deemed valuable by this harsh land, it might as well be the surface of the moon. The thought came to her gradually, like a fever building in her bones. There was a way out of this impossible situation. It would be simple. Really. The railroad tracks ran just past the edge of town, and she could hear the distant whistle of the afternoon freight train. All she had to do was walk out there and wait. It would be over quickly, and perhaps in whatever came after, she might find her parents again. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady after sitting in the heat for so long. The main street of Dusty Fork stretched before her like a gauntlet of indifference. The blacksmith hammered at his anvil, sparks flying. A cowboy watered his horse at the trough. Life went on, as it always did, regardless of one small woman's despair. Elise walked past the saloon, past the sheriff's office where she could see a large man with a badge dozing in a chair, past the last of the weathered buildings that marked the edge of civilization. The railroad tracks gleamed silver in the afternoon sun, running straight as an arrow toward distant horizons. She could feel the tremor in the rails now, the approaching thunder of iron wheels on steel. She sat down carefully on the warm metal, arranging her skirts with the same precision her governess had taught her years ago in New Orleans. Strange how habits of propriety persisted even at the end. The train whistle sounded again, closer now, and she could see the dark smudge of smoke on the horizon. This was not how she had imagined her story would end when she'd set out from Louisiana with such hope in her heart. She'd dreamed of building something meaningful in this wild country, of using her father's knowledge to help map new territories, of raising children who could read Voltaire and calculate the area of a circle with equal facility. Instead, she would become just another casualty of the frontier's brutal indifference. The ground beneath her began to vibrate more strongly. In the distance, she could make out the shape of the locomotive, black smoke billowing from its stack as it bore down on the small depot of Dusty Fork. The engineer would see her, of course, but trains couldn't stop quickly. By the time he applied the brakes, it would be far too late. Elise closed her eyes and tried to think of something beautiful. The garden behind her childhood home in New Orleans, where Jasmine climbed the walls and her mother had taught her to identify plants by their Latin names. Her father's study, lined with books and maps, where he'd shown her how to measure the world with instruments of brass and steel. The letters from Samuel Pike, full of dreams for their shared future. The whistle screamed again, much closer now, and she could hear the thunder of the approaching engine. Soon it would all be over. Soon she would be beyond the reach of men like Thaddeus Pike, beyond the grinding poverty and hopelessness that seemed to be her only options in this merciless land. The rails sang beneath her with the weight of the approaching train, and Elise Laurent prepared to meet whatever judgment awaited her beyond the veil of this harsh and unforgiving world. The thunder of hoofbeats reached her before the sound of the approaching train, cutting through the desert air like a war drum. Elise's eyes snapped open, and she turned to see a rider approaching at full gallop, his horse's hooves throwing up clouds of red dust against the blazing afternoon sky. For a moment, she thought it might be someone from town, perhaps the sheriff, come to drag her back for disturbing the peace. But as the figure drew closer, she realized this was no townsman of Dusty Fork. The rider was Comanche. She had heard stories, of course. Every settler in Texas had heard the tales whispered around campfires and in parlors. Stories of swift raids, of warriors who could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full speed, of a people who knew this land better than any map could show. The newspapers in New Orleans had painted them as savage demons. But looking at this man now, Elise saw something entirely different. He was perhaps 30 years of age, his dark hair braided with strips of leather and adorned with eagle feathers that caught the wind as he rode. His skin was bronzed by sun and weather, and he wore buckskin leggings and a shirt that had seen countless miles of hard travel. But it was his eyes that struck her most, dark as obsidian, but holding an intelligence and depth that seemed to see straight through to her soul. The train whistle shrieked again, closer now, and the warrior's gaze snapped from Elise to the approaching locomotive. Without hesitation, he spurred his horse forward, the magnificent paint stallion responding as if it could read his thoughts. They reached her just as the ground began to shake with the weight of the iron beast bearing down on them. "Move!" he shouted in accented English. But Elise found herself frozen, caught between her desperate plan and the sudden appearance of this unexpected savior. The warrior didn't wait for her to decide. He swung down from his horse in one fluid motion and scooped her up just as the locomotive's bell began clanging frantically, and sparks flew from the wheels as the engineer threw on the emergency brake. His arms were strong as steel bands around her waist as he pulled her clear of the tracks, the train thundering past them in a rush of heat and noise and coal smoke. They tumbled together onto the hard-packed earth beyond the rails, his body shielding hers from the flying gravel and debris. For a long moment they lay there, hearts pounding, as the freight cars clattered by in an endless procession of wood and iron. When the caboose finally passed and the thunder faded into the distance, the warrior rolled away from her and sat up, brushing dust from his buckskin shirt. Elise struggled to sit as well, her traveling dress tangled around her legs and her carefully pinned hair now hanging loose around her shoulders. "You were going to let it kill you," he said quietly. And it wasn't a question. His English was careful and precise, with only a slight accent coloring the words. "Why?" Elise felt heat rise in her cheeks, partly from embarrassment and partly from the realization that this stranger, this man her own people would call a heathen savage, had just saved her life without asking anything in return. I had nowhere else to go," she whispered, the words sounding pathetic even to her own ears. He studied her face with those penetrating dark eyes, taking in her tear-stained cheeks and the desperation she couldn't quite hide. "You are not from here," he observed. "Your clothes, your voice, you come from far away." "New Orleans," she admitted. "I came to marry a man named Samuel Pike, but he's dead. His brother." She stopped, unable to voice the humiliation she'd endured at Thaddeus Pike's hands. Something shifted in the warrior's expression at the mention of the Pike name. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his eyes grew harder. "Thaddeus Pike," he said, and there was a weight of knowledge in those words that made Elise look at him more sharply. "You know him?" "I know of him." The warrior stood in one smooth motion and extended a hand to help her up. "He is not a good man. What did he do to you?" Elise hesitated, then accepted his hand. His palm was calloused from years of hard living, but his touch was gentle as he pulled her to her feet. "He took everything I had," she said simply. "My belongings, my money, my father's instruments and maps. He said I was worthless, that a woman like me had no place on the frontier." The warrior's expression darkened further. "Your father was a map maker?" "A cartographer, yes, for the French government, before he died of yellow fever. He taught me to read his maps, to use his surveying tools." She looked down at her empty hands. "Pike took it all, said it was payment for the trouble I'd caused." "What kind of maps?" There was an urgency in his voice now that made her look up at him in surprise. "Survey maps, mostly. Territorial boundaries, water sources, mineral deposits. Some of them were military surveys from when the army was planning railroad routes through Indian." She stopped, realizing who she was talking to. "Through tribal lands." She finished more carefully. The warrior was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the dusty buildings of Dusty Fork in the distance. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. "My name is Joseph," he said, using the English version of what she suspected was a much different native name. "Joseph Running Bear. And I think Thaddeus Pike has something that belongs to both of us now." "Both of us?" He turned to face her fully, and she saw a determination in his eyes that reminded her of her father when he was working on a particularly challenging survey. "Those maps you speak of, they show the path the railroad wants to take through my people's land. Land that was promised to us in treaties that Pike and men like him want to pretend never existed. With those maps, we might be able to prove that the railroad is taking territory that isn't theirs to take." Elise felt a flicker of something she hadn't experienced since stepping off the stagecoach that morning. "Hope. You mean we could stop them? Make them honor the treaties?" "Perhaps. But first we would need to get those maps back." Joseph's smile was grim. "Pike will not give them up willingly, and I suspect he has other plans for your father's work than he let you know." "What do you mean?" Men like Pike don't steal something unless they see profit in it. Survey maps and military documents? Those could be worth a great deal to the right buyer. Railroad companies, mining interests, land speculators. They all need to know what lies beneath the ground and where the best routes run. The full scope of what had been taken from her began to dawn on Elise. It wasn't just her personal belongings or even her means of survival. It was information that could shape the future of this entire territory. Information that Pike could sell to the highest bidder, regardless of what damage it might do to the people who called this land home. "We have to get them back," she said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. Joseph studied her for a moment, perhaps seeing something in her expression that hadn't been there before. "It will be dangerous. Pike has men who work for him, hard men who don't ask questions about what they're told to do. And you..." He gestured at her travel-stained dress and city-bred appearance. "You are not exactly equipped for the kind of work this will require." "I may not look like much," Elise said, lifting her chin with a pride she'd thought Thaddeus Pike had beaten out of her. "But I'm stronger than I appear, and I know those maps better than anyone else alive. My father spent years creating them, and he taught me to read every symbol, every notation. Pike may have stolen them, but he doesn't understand what he has." For the first time since she'd met him, Joseph Running Bear smiled, a real smile that transformed his stern features and made him look younger. "Then perhaps," he said, "it's time we taught Mr. Pike the true value of what he's taken." In the distance, a dust cloud marked the passage of a wagon heading away from town. Probably Pike returning to whatever stronghold he'd built for himself in this harsh country. But for the first time since arriving in Texas, Elise felt like she had an ally. Someone who understood that her worth wasn't measured by her ability to cook or sew or bear children, but by her mind and her courage. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, but tonight she was alive. And she had found someone willing to help her reclaim not just her possessions, but her dignity. Joseph Running Bear swung back onto his paint horse and extended his hand to her again. "Come," he said. "There's a place where we can plan what comes next, and you look like you could use a meal and some rest before we begin." Elise took his hand and allowed him to pull her up behind him on the horse. As they rode away from the railroad tracks where she'd nearly ended her story, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the stirring of purpose, the beginning of hope. Thaddeus Pike had called her worthless, but a Comanche warrior had just proven him wrong. The hidden canyon lay 3 miles south of Dusty Fork, carved deep into the red stone by countless seasons of wind and rain. Joseph guided his paint horse down a narrow trail that seemed invisible until they were already following it. The walls of weathered sandstone rising on either side like ancient sentinels. At the bottom, a small spring bubbled up from the rocks, creating a pool of clear water surrounded by cottonwoods and wild grass, an oasis of green in the harsh desert landscape. "This place has been sanctuary for my people for many generations," Joseph said as he helped Elise down from the horse. "The white man's maps do not show it, and those who know of it understand its value." Elise looked around the hidden valley with wonder. After the brutal heat and dust of the town, the cool air rising from the spring felt like a blessing. The sound of water trickling over stone was like music after the harsh voices and grinding wheels of civilization. For the first time since leaving New Orleans, she felt like she could breathe. Joseph led his horse to the water and began removing the bridle with practiced efficiency. "You said your father was a cartographer for the French government," he said without looking at her. "What kind of work did he do exactly?" Elise settled herself on a flat rock near the spring, grateful to rest her aching legs. The ride from town had been her first time on horseback, and she was already feeling the consequences. Military surveys, mostly. When the United States purchased Louisiana, there was a great need for accurate maps of the new territory. My father worked with Army engineers to chart river systems, mountain passes, mineral deposits, anything that might be strategically important. "And he taught you to read these maps?" He taught me everything. The memory brought both pride and sadness to her voice. Mathematics, geography, cartography, even some engineering principles. He said knowledge was the only inheritance that could never be stolen. She laughed bitterly. He was wrong about that, it seems. Joseph finished tending to his horse and turned to face her. In the softer light of the canyon, she could see that his features held both strength and intelligence. And there was a gentleness in his manner that surprised her. The stories she'd heard had painted all Comanche as fierce warriors, but this man seemed as comfortable discussing maps and treaties as he did handling weapons. "Tell me about these specific maps Pike took," he said, settling himself across from her near the spring. "What did they show?" Elise closed her eyes. Calling up the memory of her father's work spread across their dining table in New Orleans. There were territorial boundary surveys from the 1840s, showing the exact lines established by treaty with various tribes. Water rights documentation, every spring, creek, and river for hundreds of miles, including seasonal patterns. Mineral surveys indicating copper, silver, and coal deposits. She opened her eyes and looked directly at Joseph. And railroad survey maps showing proposed routes from Houston to Santa Fe, including detailed analysis of which paths would be most profitable and which would encounter the least resistance. Joseph's expression grew more serious with each item she mentioned. These railroad surveys? Did they show routes through Comanche territory? 3 different proposed routes. My father noted that the northernmost path would cross through what the documents called treaty lands, and would require either new negotiations or... She hesitated. Or what? Or military action to clear the way. The words came out quietly, but they hung in the air between them like a challenge. Joseph was silent for a long moment, staring into the clear water of the spring. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of bitter experience. For 10 years, we have watched the white settlers push deeper into our lands. Always they promise the treaties will be honored, that we will be left in peace on the territory that remains to us. But the promises are like morning mist. They vanish as soon as the sun grows hot. These maps could prove that the railroad companies are planning to violate the treaties. Elise said, "If we could get them to the right authorities." "Authorities?" Joseph's laugh was harsh. "You mean like Sheriff Carter in Dusty Fork? Or perhaps Judge Morrison in San Antonio, who owns stock in 3 different railroad companies?" He shook his head. "There are no authorities who will stand against men like Pike when there is money to be made." Elise felt her heart sink. "Then what hope do we have?" "There is one man," Joseph said slowly, as if weighing each word. "A federal marshal named William Hartley, based in Amarillo. He is said to be honest, and he has no financial interest in the railroad. If we could get the evidence to him..." "Evidence?" Elise seized on the word. "You mean the maps and documents?" "Not just maps. Pike will not be content to sell them once. He will make copies, sell the information to multiple buyers, perhaps even blackmail those who have already purchased routes based on the data. Men like him always keep records of their dealings, if only to protect themselves from their partner's treachery." An idea began to form in Elise's mind, born from years of watching her father organize his meticulous work. If Pike is planning to sell the information, he'll need time to study it, to understand what he has. He'll want to verify the data, perhaps hire someone to confirm the mineral surveys or check the accuracy of the boundary measurements. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking he doesn't realize what he's stolen yet. Those maps and documents were packed in my father's traveling case, along with his instruments. Pike saw surveying tools and assumed they were valuable because they were made of brass and steel, but he probably hasn't had time to examine the papers carefully." Joseph leaned forward, interest sharpening his features. How long would it take him to understand what he has? If he finds someone who can read technical drawings and survey notations, a few days, perhaps a week. If he has to figure it out himself. Elise considered. "Pike doesn't strike me as an educated man. He might know that maps have value, but understanding the specific strategic importance of territorial boundaries and mineral rights? That could take much longer. time we could use to our advantage. Exactly. But we'd need to get the documents back before he fully realizes their worth, or before he finds someone who can explain them to him. Joseph stood and began pacing the small area near the spring, his mind clearly working through possibilities. Pike's Ranch is 15 miles northwest of town. He keeps a small army of hired guns there, men who ask no questions as long as they're paid. Getting in and out with the documents would be almost impossible. What about his office in town? He has a mining office on Main Street, but it's watched day and night. Sheriff Carter makes sure of that. Joseph stopped pacing and looked at her intently. Unless what? There might be a way, but it would require you to take a considerable risk. And I'm not certain a woman of your... He gestured at her refined appearance. Background would be capable of what needs to be done. Elise bristled at the implication. Mr. Running Bear, I may have been raised in drawing rooms and educated in libraries, but I am not helpless. I've traveled 1,000 miles alone to reach this godforsaken place, and I've already lost everything I had to lose. What exactly do you think I'm not capable of? For the first time since they'd met, Joseph smiled with genuine warmth. Forgive me. I see now why your father taught you as he did. You have the spirit of a true explorer. He sat back down, leaning forward conspiratorially. Pike's mining office has a back window that faces the alley. It's small, but someone of your size might be able to get through it. The main room is where he conducts business, but there's a smaller room in the back where he keeps his private papers. You want me to break into his office? I want us to break into his office, but you would have to be the one to go inside. My presence in town would be noticed immediately, and not in a good way. But a woman, especially one dressed as a lady, might be able to move around without attracting attention. Elise considered this. The idea of deliberately breaking the law went against everything she'd been taught about proper behavior. But then again, Pike had already committed theft against her. Perhaps it was time to abandon the rules that clearly didn't protect people like her. When would we do this? Tomorrow night. There's no moon. And Carter usually spends his evenings in Murphy's saloon. Pike himself will likely be at his ranch. He rarely stays in town overnight. And if we're caught? Joseph's expression grew serious. If you're caught, you'll be arrested and probably tried for burglary. If I'm caught... He shrugged. Let's just say that Comanche warriors don't usually receive trials in towns like Dusty Fork. The weight of what they were contemplating settled over Elise like a heavy blanket. She thought of her comfortable life in New Orleans, of the safe, predictable world she'd left behind. That woman would never have considered such a course of action, but that woman would also have sat quietly on those railroad tracks and waited for death rather than fighting for what was rightfully hers. There's something else you should know, she said finally. My father didn't just draw maps. He also kept detailed notes about his work. If Pike has those notebooks along with the maps, he'll have information about how to read the surveys, what the symbols mean, where the most valuable mineral deposits are located. It would make everything much more valuable to potential buyers. Then we'll need to get everything, maps, instruments, and notebooks. That's a lot to carry, and if someone sees me climbing out a window with armloads of stolen goods... Joseph nodded thoughtfully. We'll need a distraction, something to draw attention away from Pike's office while you're inside. As they continued planning into the evening, Elise felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's death, the thrill of working toward a goal with someone who respected her intelligence. Joseph listened to her ideas, built upon her suggestions, and treated her as an equal partner in their dangerous enterprise. When the stars came out overhead, painting the canyon walls with silver light, they had the outline of a plan. It was risky, probably foolish, and almost certainly illegal. But for the first time since arriving in Texas, Elise Laurent felt like she was fighting back. And regardless of what tomorrow might bring, that felt like victory enough. The next evening found Elise crouched behind a stack of empty crates in the alley behind Pike's mining office, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. She had spent the day observing the town from various vantage points, noting the rhythms of daily life, the comings and goings of the key players in their dangerous game. What she had learned had not been encouraging. Dusty Fork was a town built on fear and greed, held together by Thaddeus Pike's iron fist and Sheriff Carter's willingness to look the other way. The mining office sat in the center of Main Street like a spider in its web, with Pike's influence radiating outward through every business, every transaction, every conversation whispered in dark corners. She had watched Pike himself arrive that morning in a cloud of dust and arrogance, his hired men flanking him like loyal hounds. There was Frank Keeler, a mountain of a man with scars across his knuckles and dead eyes that seemed to see everything. There was Tom Briggs, lean and quick, with a gun that rode low on his hip and a reputation for using it. And there were others, hard men who had drifted to Dusty Fork like carrion birds, drawn by the promise of easy money and fewer questions than they might face in more civilized places. Sheriff Ben Carter was exactly what Joseph had described, a man who wore his badge like a costume, playing at law while serving only power. Elise had watched him accept an envelope from Pike with the casual ease of long practice, their exchange taking place in broad daylight on the steps of the jailhouse. Whatever justice existed in Dusty Fork flowed through Pike's coffers, not through any court of law. But it was the town's women who had provided the most disturbing insights into Pike's character. At the general store, she had overheard Mrs. and Emma Patterson whispering to another customer about families who had disappeared after crossing Pike's interests. At the boarding house, the elderly proprietress, Mrs. Sarah Coleman, had refused to speak Pike's name aloud, crossing herself whenever he was mentioned and muttering prayers under her breath. "He owns this town body and soul," Mrs. Coleman had said when Elise had carefully inquired about local business leaders. "Came here 5 years ago with nothing but a silver tongue and a handful of gold coins. And now," she had shaken her head, "now he decides who prospers and who suffers. The good Lord help anyone who stands in his way." The mining office itself was a study in ostentation, larger than necessary, built with expensive materials hauled in from distant cities, designed to impress rather than serve any practical function. Pike clearly wanted everyone who saw it to understand his importance, his permanence in their small world. As darkness fell and the sounds of evening revelry began to drift from Murphy's saloon, Elise adjusted her position behind the crates and checked the small window that would be her point of entry. Joseph had been right. It was barely large enough for a person of her slight build, and getting through it would require considerable athleticism. But it was also the only opening that wasn't visible from the street, and the alley remained empty most of the time. The plan they had developed was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. Joseph would create a distraction at the far end of town, something noisy enough to draw the attention of anyone watching the mining office, but not so dramatic as to bring the entire town running, while all eyes were focused elsewhere. Elise would slip through the window, locate her father's materials, and escape the same way she had entered. Simple, except for the dozen ways it could go catastrophically wrong. A sound from the mouth of the alley made her freeze, pressing herself deeper into the shadows. Heavy footsteps approached, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the low murmur of conversation. 2 men appeared, silhouetted against the lamplight from Main Street. "Pike wants everything locked up tight tonight," one of them was saying. She recognized the voice as belonging to Frank Keeler. "Says he's got important business to attend to tomorrow, and he don't want no interruptions." What kind of business? This was Tom Briggs, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of a man comfortable with violence. "The kind that pays real well, if we do our jobs right. He's got some maps and papers he reckoned from that French girl, and, come morning, he's meeting with some railroad men who might be mighty interested in what they show." Elise's blood turned to ice. Pike had already figured out the value of her father's work, and he was planning to sell it tomorrow. If they didn't act tonight, the maps and documents would be gone forever, scattered to buyers who would use them to devastate tribal lands and exploit territorial rights without regard for legal treaties or human cost. Railroad men, huh? Briggs sounded impressed. Must be some valuable papers. Valuable enough that Pike's keeping them in his private safe instead of just filing them away. Says they show where to build tracks and where to dig for silver and copper. Could be worth thousands to the right folks. The two men continued down the alley, their voices fading as they made their rounds. Elise waited until she was certain they were gone before allowing herself to breathe normally again. A private safe. That complicated things considerably. She had been hoping the documents would be filed away in cabinets or desk drawers. But a safe would require skills she didn't possess. Unless... She thought back to her father's meticulous habits, his obsession with organization and security. He had kept important documents in a small safe in his study, but he had also made copies of everything, storing duplicates in various locations in case of fire or theft. Could Pike have done something similar? Or could the original documents still be mixed in with other papers, not yet sorted and secured? The sound of distant shouting broke through her thoughts, followed by the crash of breaking glass and the sharp report of a gunshot. Joseph's distraction had begun. From the direction of the noise, it sounded like something was happening near the livery stable at the edge of town. She could hear men shouting, boots running on wooden sidewalks, doors slamming as people emerged to investigate the commotion. This was her chance. Elise emerged from behind the crates and approached the window with careful steps, testing each footfall to avoid loose boards or debris that might give her away. The window was even smaller up close than it had appeared from a distance, barely 18 inches square and positioned about 6 feet off the ground. She would have to climb up, squeeze through, and drop down into the office, all while remaining completely silent. She gathered her skirts, grateful now for the practical traveling dress rather than the elaborate gowns she had once favored. Using a smaller crate as a step, she managed to reach the window and work the simple latch that held it closed. The glass panels swung inward with barely a whisper of sound. Getting through proved to be every bit as difficult as she had anticipated. Her shoulders barely fit through the opening, and she had to contort herself awkwardly to avoid catching her dress on the frame. For a terrifying moment, she thought she might be stuck, trapped half in and half out of the building while the sounds of Joseph's distraction grew more distant. Then she was through, tumbling onto the floor of Pike's office with less grace than she would have preferred, but blessedly little noise. She lay still for a moment, listening for any indication that her entry had been detected. The building remained silent. Slowly, carefully, she rose to her feet and began to examine her surroundings. The office was larger than it had appeared from outside, divided into 2 rooms connected by an open doorway. The front room contained Pike's desk, several chairs for visitors, and walls lined with mining claims and territorial maps. But it was the back room that drew her attention, a smaller space that seemed to serve as Pike's private study. She moved toward the back room, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. A small amount of light filtered in from the street lamps outside, just enough to make out shapes and shadows. Pike's private study was a monument to his ambitions. Expensive furniture, leather-bound books that probably had never been opened, and along one wall, a large iron safe that must have cost more than most people in Dusty Fork earned in a year. But it was the desk that caught her attention. Scattered across its surface were papers, maps, and what looked unmistakably like her father's leather portfolio. Pike had been studying the documents, trying to understand their significance, and in his haste or arrogance, he had left them out rather than securing them in the safe. Elise moved to the desk, her hands trembling with excitement and fear. There were her father's survey maps, his careful notations still visible in the margins. There were the territorial boundary documents, the mineral surveys, the railroad route analyses, everything that Pike had stolen from her, spread out like a feast for greedy eyes. But there was something else as well. A ledger book lay open beside the maps, filled with Pike's crude handwriting. Even in the dim light, she could make out enough to understand what she was seeing: a record of Pike's various illegal enterprises, his bribes to local officials, his plans for selling territorial information to the highest bidders. This was more than she had hoped for. Not only could she reclaim her father's work, but she could also gather evidence of Pike's corruption that might bring him to justice. She began gathering the papers, rolling the maps carefully and tucking the documents into her bodice and the folds of her dress. The ledger was too large to hide on her person, but she tore out several of the most incriminating pages and added them to her collection. If they could get this evidence to Marshal Hartley in Amarillo, it might be enough to end Pike's reign of terror in Dusty Fork. As she worked, the sounds of commotion from the far end of town continued, but they seemed to be dying down. Joseph's distraction wouldn't last much longer, and she needed to be gone before curious eyes turned back toward the center of town. She had just finished securing the last of the documents when she heard the unmistakable sound of the front door opening. Heavy footsteps entered the office, accompanied by a voice she recognized with a chill of terror. "Keeler, check the back room. Make sure everything's secure before we lock up for the night." Thaddeus Pike had returned. Elise looked desperately around the back room, searching for somewhere to hide. The desk was too small to conceal her, and the safe offered no shelter. Her only option was the window she had entered through, but reaching it would require crossing the room in full view of anyone standing in the doorway. The footsteps were getting closer. Frank Keeler's massive frame appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the lamplight from the front room. For a moment that lasted forever. He stood perfectly still, and Elise was certain he had seen her crouched behind the desk. Then he grunted and turned back toward Pike. "Everything looks fine. Boss, safe still locked. Papers are where you left them." Elise realized with a start that the darkness that had made her work so difficult was also concealing her from casual observation. Keeler had looked into the room but hadn't seen her in the shadows. "Good." Pike's voice carried clearly from the front room. "Tomorrow's going to be a profitable day, and I don't want any surprises. Those railroad men are bringing serious money for the right information." She heard Pike moving around the front office, probably securing other papers or preparing to leave. This might be her only chance to escape, but it would require incredible timing and more than a little luck. Taking a deep breath, Elise rose from behind the desk and moved toward the window as quietly as possible. Every step seemed to echo like thunder in her ears, and she was certain that Pike and Keeler would hear her at any moment. She reached the window just as Pike's voice called out again. "Blow out that lamp, Keeler. Time to get back to the ranch." The light from the front room disappeared, plunging the office into complete darkness. Using the cover of absolute blackness, Elise climbed onto the windowsill and began working her way through the opening. The stolen documents crinkled softly against her dress, and she prayed the sound wouldn't carry to the men in the next room. She was halfway through the window when her dress caught on the frame, the fabric tearing with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. She froze, certain that she had been discovered. "What was that?" Keeler's voice was sharp with suspicion. "Probably just a cat in the alley," Pike replied, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Check it out." Elise heard heavy footsteps moving toward the back room, and she knew she was out of time. With a desperate lunge, she tore free of the window frame and tumbled into the alley, landing hard on the packed earth. Her dress was ruined, her hands scraped and bleeding, but she had the documents and she was alive. She could hear Keeler moving around inside the office, probably checking the window. In moments, he would discover that it was unlatched and raise the alarm. She had to get away, had to reach Joseph and escape Dusty Fork before Pike realized what had been taken. Gathering her torn skirts, Elise ran for the shadows at the mouth of the alley, the stolen evidence clutched against her chest like a shield against the darkness that was about to descend on them all. Elise had barely reached the mouth of the alley when Keeler's voice roared through the night air like thunder across the plains. "Boss, the window's been jimmied. Someone's been in here." The shout was followed by the crash of furniture being overturned, and Pike's voice raised in a string of curses that would have made a riverboat captain blush. Within seconds, The mining office erupted in activity, boots stomping, doors slamming, orders being barked with military precision. "Get the horses. Check every building on this street. Find whoever did this." Pike's voice carried the edge of a man who had built his empire on violence and wasn't about to let it crumble without a fight. Elise pressed herself against the wall at the corner of the alley, her heart pounding so hard she was certain it could be heard over the commotion. The documents she had stolen crinkled against her chest with every breath, a constant reminder of both her success and her peril. She had to get to Joseph, had to reach their meeting point at the old church ruins on the edge of town. But Main Street was already filling with Pike's men. Through the chaos, she caught sight of Frank Keeler emerging from the mining office with a kerosene lamp held high, its yellow light casting dancing shadows across the buildings. Behind him came Pike himself, his face twisted with rage and something else, a cold calculation that was far more frightening than simple anger. "Spread out," Pike commanded his assembled men. "Check every hiding spot, every shadow. Whoever did this is still close by, and they've got something that belongs to me." Tom Briggs appeared from around the corner, leading 2 saddled horses. "Want me to check the saloon, boss? Could be someone's trying to lay low with the drunks." "Do it, and send Williams to watch the depot in case they try to catch the morning train." Pike's eyes swept the street with predatory intensity. This was no random thief looking for loose change. Someone knew exactly what they were after. Elise felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Pike was thinking like the dangerous man he was, methodically closing off escape routes and considering motives. It wouldn't be long before he started thinking about the French girl who had arrived just days ago, the one whose belongings he had stolen, the one who would have the strongest reason to break into his office. She needed to move, but Main Street offered no cover. Every doorway, every alley entrance was either occupied by Pike's men or illuminated by their torches. The only path that might offer concealment led behind the buildings on the opposite side of the street, but reaching it would require crossing 30 yards of open ground in full view of anyone looking in her direction. The sound of splintering wood from inside the mining office told her that Pike's search was intensifying. Soon he would discover exactly what was missing, and when that happened, his hunt would become even more focused and deadly. Taking a deep breath, Elise gathered her torn skirts and prepared to make a run for it. She had taken only 2 steps when a hand closed over her mouth and a strong arm pulled her back into the shadows. "Don't move," Joseph's voice whispered in her ear, so quiet it was barely audible. "They're watching the street." Relief flooded through her so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. Joseph had come to find her, had somehow navigated through Pike's men to reach this spot. She turned in his arms and saw his paint horse waiting in the deeper shadows behind them, nearly invisible in the darkness. "Did you get them?" he asked, his voice still barely a whisper. She nodded and carefully extracted some of the papers from her bodice, showing him the edge of one of her father's maps. His eyes widened as he recognized the significance of what she had accomplished. "There's more," she breathed. His ledger books, records of bribes and illegal deals, enough to bring him down if we can get it to the right people. Joseph's expression grew grim. "First, we have to get out of town alive. Pike's got men at every exit, and more are coming in from his ranch. I heard the sound of riders approaching from the northwest," as if summoned by his words. The thunder of hoofbeats echoed from the direction of Pike's property. A dozen men appeared at the far end of Main Street, their horses lathered with sweat from hard riding. These weren't the casual hired guns who drifted through frontier towns looking for easy work. These were hardened professionals, men who wore their weapons like other people wore clothing and who followed Pike's orders without question or hesitation. "There's Jacob Stone," Joseph murmured, pointing to a lean man with a silver hair who seemed to command the newcomers. "Pike's enforcer. If he's here, it means Pike considers this a serious threat to his operations." Stone dismounted and strode directly to where Pike stood in the middle of the street, even from their hiding place. Elise could see the respect and fear Pike's men showed the older gunman. When Stone spoke, everyone else fell silent to listen. What's the situation, Mr. Pike? Someone broke into my office and stole documents. Important documents that could cause us considerable trouble if they end up in the wrong hands. Pike's voice carried clearly in the night air. I want whoever did this found and dealt with permanently. Stone nodded with the calm efficiency of a man who had handled such problems many times before. Any idea who might have done it? I've got suspicions. There was a French woman arrived a few days ago. Claimed to be Samuel's mail-order bride. I sent her packing, but she might have come back looking for revenge. Description: small, dark hair, educated accent, probably still wearing traveling clothes, dark blue dress with fancy buttons. Pike paused, then added with cold certainty. She's got help, though. This was too well planned for one person, especially a city-bred woman. Elise felt Joseph tense beside her. Pike's description was accurate enough that any of his men would recognize her instantly if they spotted her, and the mention of help meant that Joseph was also in danger, perhaps even more so than she was. Stone was already organizing the search with military precision. Briggs, take 4 men and check every building on the south side of town. Williams, you and your boys take the north side. I want every door kicked in, every hiding place searched. And remember, we need them alive long enough to find out who else might know about this. The search parties dispersed with practiced efficiency, moving through the town like a net closing around its prey. Within minutes, Elise could hear doors being battered down, angry voices demanding answers, the sounds of possessions being scattered and furniture overturned. We can't stay here, Joseph whispered. They'll work their way to this end of the street soon enough. Where can we go? They've got the whole town covered. Joseph was silent for a moment, his eyes scanning the buildings around them with the intensity of a hunter tracking dangerous prey. Then his gaze fixed on something across the street, and a grim smile crossed his features. You said there was more evidence in that office, ledger books and other papers? Yes, but we can't go back. Pike's probably got it guarded now. What if Pike didn't have a choice about leaving it unguarded? Before Elise could ask what he meant, Joseph was moving, leading his horse deeper into the shadows behind the buildings. He guided her through a maze of back alleys and storage sheds, keeping to the darkness while the sounds of the search grew closer around them. They emerged behind Murphy's saloon, where the night air was thick with the smell of whiskey and tobacco smoke. Through the windows, Elise could see that the establishment was doing a brisk business despite, or perhaps because of, the commotion in the street. Men who lived on the edge of violence found excitement in the prospect of a manhunt, especially when they weren't the ones being hunted. Joseph secured his horse to a hitching post and pulled a bundle from his saddlebags. When he unwrapped it, Elise saw a collection of items that made her breath catch: glass bottles filled with clear liquid, rags, and what looked like materials for starting a fire. "What are you planning?" she asked, though she was beginning to understand. A distraction big enough to draw everyone away from Pike's office. Something that will force them to choose between chasing us and saving his precious building. You mean to burn it down? Fire is a powerful enemy on the frontier. When it starts, it doesn't care about wealth or power. It consumes everything in its path. Pike's men will have to fight it or watch the whole town go up in flames. Elise felt a mixture of fear and admiration for the audacity of the plan. Setting fire to a building in a frontier town was incredibly dangerous, not just because of the legal consequences, but because fire could spread rapidly in the dry climate, potentially destroying everything in its path. What about the people in the other buildings? We'll start the fire in Pike's office, then make sure everyone knows about it quickly. The volunteer fire brigade will have time to contain it if they act fast. Joseph's expression was serious. But Pike will have to choose between pursuing us and saving his business. He won't be able to do both. The logic was sound, but Elise couldn't help thinking about all the ways such a plan could go wrong. If the fire spread too quickly, innocent people could be hurt. If Pike's men realized what they were doing before they could escape, they would be trapped with no way out. But as the sounds of the search grew closer and she heard the splintering of wood from nearby buildings, she realized they had few other options. Pike was methodically closing off every avenue of escape, and it was only a matter of time before his men found their hiding place. "All right," she said quietly. "What do you need me to do?" Joseph's smile held both respect and affection. "I need you to be ready to run faster than you've ever run in your life. Once this starts, we'll have maybe 5 minutes before the whole town is after us." He handed her one of the bottles, its contents sloshing with an oily sound that suggested it was something much more flammable than water. "When I give the signal, throw this through the front window of Pike's office and then get to the horse as fast as you can." "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you, but I need to make sure the fire catches properly. This only works if Pike believes his whole empire is about to go up in smoke." They made their way back toward Main Street, moving like shadows through the maze of buildings and alleys. The search was getting closer. Elise could hear Pike's men working their way systematically through the buildings, their voices growing louder and more urgent as they failed to find their quarry. When they reached a position where they could see Pike's mining office, Elise was surprised to find it apparently unguarded. Then she realized that Pike's confidence in his search parties had led him to believe the thieves were hiding somewhere else in town, not bold enough to return to the scene of their crime. It was exactly the kind of arrogance that Joseph was counting on. "Remember," he whispered as they prepared to make their move. "Throw the bottle hard enough to break the glass, then run. Don't look back. Don't hesitate. Once this starts, everything happens very fast." Elise nodded, gripping the bottle tightly in her hand. The documents she had stolen were still pressed against her chest, a constant reminder of what they had already accomplished and what they stood to lose if they were caught. Joseph raised his hand, ready to give the signal. In the distance, she could hear Jacob Stone's voice directing the search, the sound growing closer with each passing moment. Then Joseph's hand dropped, and Elise stepped into the street, drew back her arm, and hurled the bottle with all her strength toward Pike's office window. The glass shattered with a sound like thunder, and immediately the interior of the building erupted in flames that danced and roared with unnatural hunger. Joseph's second bottle followed a moment later, and the fire spread with terrifying speed through the wooden structure. Within seconds, the entire front of Pike's mining office was ablaze, and the night sky was lit with an orange glow that could be seen for miles across the desert. The sound of the fire was like a living thing, crackling, roaring, consuming everything in its path with insatiable appetite. And from every direction came the shouts of men who suddenly had something much more important to worry about than catching a pair of thieves. The journey through the desert night seemed to last forever, each mile marked by the constant fear of pursuit and the growing certainty that they had crossed a line from which there could be no return. Joseph's paint horse carried them both with the steady endurance of an animal bred for survival on the harsh frontier. But even the strongest mount could only run so far before exhaustion claimed it. Behind them, the orange glow of Pike's burning office had faded to a distant flicker on the horizon, but the memory of those flames would stay with Elise forever. She had watched Pike's empire begin to crumble, had seen his men torn between chasing their quarry and saving what remained of their employer's business. The choice had cost them precious time, and Joseph had used every minute to put distance between them and Dusty Fork. They rode through a landscape that seemed carved from shadow and starlight, following trails that existed more in Joseph's memory than on any map. Twice they had stopped to rest the horse and listen for the sound of pursuing riders, but the desert remained silent except for the distant call of coyotes and the whisper of wind through sagebrush. It was near dawn when they finally reached the Comanche camp, hidden in a canyon so remote and well concealed that Elise would never have found it without a guide. The first light of morning revealed a community that seemed to exist in perfect harmony with the harsh landscape. Hide lodges arranged in careful patterns, horse corrals that used natural rock formations for walls, and cooking fires that produced almost no visible smoke. But as they approached the camp, Elise became aware of the tension that greeted their arrival. Warriors emerged from the lodges with weapons ready, their faces hard with suspicion and barely controlled anger. Women gathered their children close, their eyes fixed on the white woman who had brought unknown dangers to their sanctuary. Joseph dismounted and helped Elise down from the horse, his movements careful and deliberate. He spoke quickly in Comanche to a group of approaching warriors, his words too rapid for Elise to follow, but his tone clearly defensive. She caught her own name mentioned several times, along with what sounded like explanations or justifications. An older warrior stepped forward from the group, his graying hair adorned with eagle feathers and his weathered face marked by the scars of countless battles. This was clearly a man of importance in the tribe, someone whose word carried the weight of authority and experience. "You bring the white woman here?" he asked Joseph in heavily accented English, his dark eyes fixed on Elise with unconcealed hostility. "You bring trouble to our people." "This is Thomas Eagle Feather," Joseph said quietly to Elise, "war chief of our band. He has the right to question what we've done." Eagle Feather continued speaking, his voice rising with each word. Even without understanding Comanche, Elise could hear the anger and concern in his tone. Other warriors gathered around, their faces showing varying degrees of suspicion and outright hostility. "What is he saying?" Elise whispered. Joseph's jaw tightened as he listened to the war chief's words. "He says we have brought the white man's violence to a place of peace, that by stealing from Pike and burning his building, we have given him reason to attack our people. He wants to know why we didn't simply let the white woman die as she intended." The blunt words hit Elise like a physical blow. She understood now that her presence here was seen not as refuge, but as contamination, bringing the conflicts of the white world into a place that had remained hidden and safe. "Tell him," she said, raising her voice so that all the gathered warriors could hear, "that I don't want to bring harm to his people. If my being here puts them in danger, I'll leave immediately." Joseph translated her words, but Eagle Feather's expression didn't soften. He spoke again, his tone sharp with challenge. "He says words are easy, but actions speak truth. He wants to know what we accomplished that was worth the risk to his people." This was the moment Elise had been preparing for since they'd fled Dusty Fork. Carefully, she reached into her bodice and extracted the stolen documents, holding them up for all to see. The papers rustled in the morning breeze, and she could see the warriors' eyes focus on them with new interest. "These maps show the railroad's plan to build through your treaty lands," she said, unrolling one of her father's survey maps so that Eagle Feather could see the detailed markings. "They also show mineral deposits that the white men want to steal, and water sources they plan to control." Joseph translated, pointing to specific features on the map as he spoke. Elise saw Eagle Feather's expression change as he began to understand what he was looking at. The hostility remained, but it was now mixed with something else, a recognition of the strategic importance of what she had risked her life to obtain. An elderly woman emerged from one of the larger lodges, her gray hair braided with silver ornaments and her presence commanding immediate respect from all the warriors. Even Eagle Feather stepped aside as she approached, his aggressive posture becoming more deferential. "This is Mary Wise Crow," Joseph explained. "She is the eldest of our council, keeper of our treaties and agreements with the white government." Wise Crow examined the documents with eyes that missed nothing, her weathered fingers tracing the boundary lines and survey markings with the skill of someone who understood their significance. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of age and wisdom. "She says these papers prove what we have long suspected," Joseph translated. "The railroad men plan to take our land regardless of what the treaties promise. But she also says that having the proof and being able to use it are different things." "What does she mean?" Joseph listened as Wise Crow continued speaking, her words accompanied by gestures toward the documents and then toward the horizon where Dusty Fork lay. "She says the white man's law is like a snake. It can bite those who try to use it as much as those it's used against. These papers prove the railroad's dishonesty, but they were obtained by theft and violence. The white courts might not accept them as evidence." Elise felt her heart sink. After all they had risked, after Joseph had saved her life and she had proven her worth by obtaining the crucial documents, it might still not be enough to stop Pike's plans. But Wise Crow wasn't finished speaking. She gestured toward Elise and spoke directly to her, her tone serious but no longer hostile. "She says there is another way." Joseph explained, "If you are willing to risk your life once more, there might be a path to justice that even the white courts cannot ignore." "What kind of path?" Wise Crow spoke again, her words carefully measured. Joseph's translation came slowly, as if he were weighing each word for its full meaning. "She says you must become a witness, not just a thief. The documents you've taken prove Pike's plans, but they need to be presented to the white authorities by someone who can testify to how they were obtained and what they mean." "You mean I have to turn myself in?" "Not turn yourself in, but you must find a way to bring this evidence to someone who can act on it legally. Someone who has the authority to investigate Pike's operations and bring charges against him." Eagle Feather spoke again, his tone still skeptical but less openly hostile than before. Elise could see that the documents had changed the dynamic of the conversation, transforming her from an unwelcome burden into a potential asset. "The war chief says Pike will not let this attack go unanswered." Joseph translated, "He will come looking for revenge, and when he does, innocent people will suffer. The only way to stop him is to destroy his power completely, not just burn one building." Wise Crow nodded agreement and spoke again, her words directed toward the assembled warriors as much as toward Elise and Joseph. "She says the papers you've brought show more than just railroad plans. They show Pike's connections to other powerful white men, his bribes to officials, his plans to cheat the government as well as our people. This information could bring down more than just Pike. It could expose a whole network of corruption." Elise studied the faces around her, seeing a mixture of hope and skepticism in the eyes of the Comanche warriors. These were people who had been betrayed too many times by white promises to trust easily. But they were also pragmatic enough to recognize an opportunity when it presented itself. "There's something else," she said, pulling out the pages she had torn from Pike's ledger. "These show his financial dealings, the bribes he's paid, the officials he's corrupted. This isn't just about the railroad. It's evidence of widespread criminal activity." Joseph examined the ledger pages, his expression growing more serious as he read. He spoke rapidly to Wise Crow and Eagle Feather, showing them specific entries and explaining their significance. "This changes everything," he said finally. "These records show that Pike has been cheating the federal government as well as our people. There are tax evasions, fraudulent mining claims, bribery of federal officials. This is the kind of evidence that even corrupt local courts couldn't ignore." Wise Crow studied the documents for a long moment, then spoke with the authority of final decision. "She says you have proven your worth and your commitment to justice." Joseph translated, "But she also says the greatest test still lies ahead, to stop Pike and his allies. We must take this evidence to the federal authorities in Amarillo. It will be a dangerous journey, and Pike will do everything in his power to stop us." "I'm ready," Elise said without hesitation. "I've come this far, and I won't turn back now." Eagle Feather spoke again, his tone carrying a grudging respect that hadn't been there before. "He says you fight like a warrior, even though you look like a soft white woman. He gives permission for Joseph to guide you to Amarillo, and he promises that our people will help protect your trail." Wise Crow added something else, her words accompanied by a slight smile that transformed her stern features. "She says you have earned the right to be called by a Comanche name." Joseph explained, "She calls you woman who steals justice, one who takes back what was wrongfully taken." As the sun climbed higher over the hidden canyon, Elise felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the desert heat. These people, whom her own culture had taught her to fear and despise, had accepted her as an ally in their fight for survival. They had looked past her pale skin and foreign ways to see the courage and determination that drove her. The journey to Amarillo would be perilous, and there was no guarantee that Marshal Hartley would be willing or able to act on the evidence they carried. Pike's influence extended far beyond Dusty Fork, and his network of corrupt officials might reach even into the federal courts. But for the first time since stepping off the train in that dusty frontier town, Elise felt like she was part of something larger than her own survival. She had found allies in the most unexpected place, and together they might just be strong enough to bring justice to a land where power had too long rested in the hands of men like Thaddeus Pike. The stolen documents rustled in the morning breeze, carrying with them the promise of truth finally brought to light, and in the faces of the Comanche warriors around her, Elise saw the same determination that burned in her own heart, the refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. The journey to Amarillo began before dawn, when the desert air still held the cool promise of night and the stars provided more light than the pale sliver of moon. Elise had spent 2 days in the Comanche camp, learning what she could about desert survival and allowing her torn dress to be mended by the skilled hands of the tribal women. They had also provided her with more practical clothing, buckskin leggings and a simple tunic that would blend better with the landscape and allow for easier movement. Joseph led the way on his paint horse, while Elise rode a gentle mare that Wise Crow had insisted she take. A gift, the elder woman had said through Joseph's translation, from one who seeks justice to another, tucked safely in a leather pouch beneath her clothing. The stolen documents felt like both a burden and a beacon of hope. They were not traveling alone. Eagle Feather had assigned 2 young warriors, Daniel Swift Arrow and Robert White Wolf, to accompany them part way to ensure they cleared Comanche territory safely. These men knew every water source, every hidden trail, every cave that could provide shelter from both the elements and pursuing enemies. Pike's men have been seen moving through the desert, Swift Arrow had reported in careful English. They search in groups, but they do not know the land as we do. We can avoid them, but it will mean a longer journey. The first day passed without incident, their small party making good time across terrain that seemed impossible to navigate. Joseph led them through arroyos and canyons that provided concealment from distant observers, while the young warriors ranged ahead and behind, watching for signs of pursuit or ambush. It was late afternoon when they encountered their first sign of civilization since leaving the hidden camp, a small ranch house built in a valley where a seasonal creek provided enough water for a modest spread. Smoke rose from the chimney, and cattle grazed in a fenced pasture that spoke of hard work and careful husbandry. "That's the Hayes place," Joseph said, studying the ranch through field glasses borrowed from Eagle Feather. "Martha Hayes is a widow woman. Lost her husband to Pike's men 2 years back when he tried to resist their claim-jumping operation. You think she'll help us?" "Maybe. She's got no love for Pike, that's certain. But she's also got to live in this country. And Pike has a long memory for those who cross him." Swift Arrow rode back from his scouting position ahead, his expression urgent. "Riders coming from the north," he reported. 6 men, moving fast. They'll reach the Hayes place before we can get clear." Joseph cursed softly and studied the approaching dust cloud through the glasses. "Pike's men, they're probably questioning every ranch and settlement between here and Amarillo, looking for word of us. Can we go around them?" "Not without being seen crossing open ground, and if they spot us running, they'll know we're who they're looking for." Joseph made a quick decision. "We'll have to risk the Hayes place. Martha might be willing to hide us until they move on." They approached the ranch house at a gallop, reaching the front yard just as Martha Hayes emerged from her kitchen garden with a basket of vegetables. She was a woman in her 40s, weathered by frontier life but still strong, with graying brown hair pinned back in a practical bun and intelligent eyes that took in their desperate situation immediately. "Joseph Running Bear," she said, setting down her basket. "Been a while since you've come calling, and you've brought friends." "Friends in need of help. Mrs. Hayes, Pike's men are maybe 10 minutes behind us, and they're looking for trouble." Martha's expression hardened at the mention of Pike's name. "Same kind of trouble they brought my William." "The same kind." "Yes, ma'am. This lady here has evidence that could put Pike away for good, but we need to get her to the federal marshal in Amarillo alive." Martha studied Elise with sharp eyes, taking in the practical frontier clothing and the determined set of her jaw. "You the one who burned down Pike's office in Dusty Fork?" Elise blinked in surprise. "How did you—" "Word travels fast out here, especially good news. First time in years someone stood up to that devil. Martha smiled grimly. Come on, then. I've got a root cellar that's kept me and mine safe through Indian raids and winter storms. Should do well enough for Pike's hired guns. She led them quickly to a concealed entrance behind the house, pulling back a heavy wooden cover to reveal a substantial underground chamber lined with stone and stocked with preserved foods and emergency supplies. William built this when we first came here. Said a man never knew when he might need a place to lay low for a while. The hiding place was cramped but well ventilated, with enough room for all four of them to crouch comfortably. Martha handed down blankets and a jug of water, then carefully replaced the cover and scattered leaves and debris over it to hide any sign of recent disturbance. They didn't have to wait long. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, followed by the rough voices of men accustomed to taking what they wanted through intimidation and force. Afternoon, Mrs. Hayes. The voice belonged to someone Elise didn't recognize, but Joseph tensed at the sound. Afternoon, Mr. Caldwell. What brings you out to my little place? Looking for some folks who've caused Mr. Pike considerable trouble. Thought you might have seen them pass through. A white woman and an Indian. Probably traveling together. Can't say as I have. Don't get many visitors out here these days. Through a gap in the cellar cover, Elise could see Martha standing calmly in her yard, basket still in hand, facing down 5 armed men with the quiet courage of someone who had faced worse and survived. You sure about that, ma'am? Because Mr. Pike is offering a substantial reward for information leading to their capture. Enough money to make a widow woman's life a lot more comfortable. I appreciate Mr. Pike's generosity, Martha replied dryly. But I haven't seen hide nor hair of anyone matching that description. Caldwell dismounted and began walking around the property, his eyes scanning for signs of recent visitors. The other men spread out, checking the barn and outbuildings with the methodical thoroughness of experienced trackers. Find anything? Caldwell called to his men. Fresh horse droppings in the corral. One of them replied, but they could be from her own animals. Check the house. Now see here, Martha protested, but her objection was ignored as 2 of the men pushed past her into the small ranch house. Elise could hear them moving around inside, overturning furniture and opening cabinets in their search. Nothing here, boss, came the report. Just the usual household goods. Caldwell walked back to where Martha stood, his expression frustrated but not yet suspicious. You sure you haven't seen anything unusual? Mrs. Hayes? Maybe tracks crossing your land or someone asking for water? Like I told you, Mr. Caldwell. It's been quiet out here, just me and my chickens and the cattle. For a long moment, Caldwell studied her face, looking for any sign of deception. Martha met his gaze steadily, her weathered hands folded calmly over the handle of her vegetable basket. All right, then, Caldwell said finally. But if you do see anything at all, you'd best send word to Mr. Pike immediately. He's not in a forgiving mood these days, especially toward folks who might be harboring fugitives. I'll keep that in mind. The men remounted and rode off toward the south, their dust cloud gradually disappearing into the vast emptiness of the desert. Martha waited until they were completely out of sight before lifting the cellar cover and motioning for her hidden guests to emerge. Thank you, Elise said as she climbed out of the hiding place. You saved our lives. Maybe, Martha replied. But they'll be back, and next time they might not be so easily convinced. You need to get moving, and you need to stay off the main trails. Is there another route to Amarillo? Joseph asked. Martha nodded toward the eastern horizon. There's an old Apache trail that runs through the Badlands. Harder going, and you'll need to know where the waterholes are. But it'll keep you clear of the roads Pike's men are watching. She went into the house and returned with a hand-drawn map on a piece of brown paper. William surveyed those lands before we settled here. This shows the safe water sources and the best places to make camp. It'll add 2 days to your journey, but it's better than being dead. Swift Arrow studied the map with professional interest. This is good work. Your husband knew the land well. He learned from your people. Martha said quietly. An old Apache named Greyhawk taught him to read the desert like a book, said it was knowledge that might save his life someday. Her expression grew sad. Didn't help him against Pike's guns, though. Joseph folded the map carefully and tucked it into his shirt. We won't forget this, Mrs. Hayes. Just make sure that evidence gets to someone who can use it. William and a lot of other good people deserve justice. They prepared to leave immediately, knowing that every minute they delayed increased the chance of another encounter with Pike's search parties. Martha provided them with additional supplies, dried meat, hardtack, and extra water, refusing any payment despite Joseph's protests. Consider it an investment in justice, she said firmly. As they rode away from the Hayes Ranch, following Martha's map toward the eastern Badlands, Elise reflected on the unexpected allies they had found in this harsh country. First the Comanche, now this courageous widow woman. People who had every reason to fear Pike's retribution but chose to help anyway because they believed in something larger than their own safety. The terrain grew more challenging as they climbed into the rocky hills that marked the edge of the Badlands. Ancient stone formations rose from the desert floor like the bones of sleeping giants, and the trail became little more than a suggestion carved into the rock by countless years of wind and rain. This is where we leave you, Swift Arrow announced as they reached a high pass that offered a view of the country ahead. From here, the trail leads to Apache territory. They know Joseph and will not molest peaceful travelers, but they might not understand our presence. White Wolf added his own warning. Pike's men may follow this far, but no farther. Even they are not foolish enough to enter the Badlands without Apache permission. The two young warriors clasped Joseph's hand in farewell, then rode back toward their hidden canyon home. Elise watched them disappear among the rocks, feeling a pang of loss at the departure of their protectors. Are we really safe from Pike's men now? She asked. Joseph studied the forbidding landscape ahead, a maze of canyons and mesas that stretched to the horizon under the blazing afternoon sun. Safer, he said. But the desert itself is just as dangerous as any human enemy. From here on, every mile will test our ability to survive. They began the descent into the Badlands, following Martha Hayes's carefully drawn map toward water sources that might mean the difference between life and death. Behind them, the dust of their passage settled slowly in the still air, while ahead lay 3 days of the most dangerous country on the frontier. But in the leather pouch beneath Elise's tunic, the stolen documents waited patiently for their moment of revelation, carrying with them the power to transform the lawless frontier into a place where justice might finally prevail. The town of Amarillo appeared before them like a mirage after 3 days of desert travel, its buildings shimmering in the heat waves that rose from the baked earth. Elise had never been so grateful to see civilization, even though she knew that their greatest challenge still lay ahead. Getting the evidence to Marshal Hartley was only the beginning. They would need to convince him to act on it, and that meant trusting a man they had never met with their lives and their cause. Joseph led them to the edge of town, where they could observe the streets and buildings without being seen. Amarillo was larger than Dusty Fork, with wide streets designed to accommodate freight wagons and cattle drives, substantial buildings that spoke of prosperity and permanence, and the busy activity of a community that served as a hub for the surrounding ranches and settlements. There's the Federal Building, Joseph said, pointing to a 2-story structure built of red brick with the flag of the United States flying from a pole in front. Marshal Hartley's office will be on the 2nd floor. Elise studied the building, noting the armed guards at the entrance and the official carriages parked outside. This was clearly a place where serious business was conducted, where decisions were made that affected the lives of people across the territory. How do we approach him? She asked. We can't just walk in looking like fugitives and expect him to listen to our story. Joseph was quiet for a moment, considering their options. There's a boarding house on the other side of town, run by a Mexican woman named Carmen Valdez. She's helped my people before when we've had business with the territorial government. She might be willing to let you clean up and present yourself properly. They made their way carefully through the back streets of Amarillo, avoiding the main thoroughfares where they might be recognized by any of Pike's agents who could have reached the town ahead of them. The boarding house was a modest but well-maintained establishment, with a small garden in back and the smell of cooking food that made Elise realize how hungry she had become during their desert journey. Carmen Valdez was a woman in her 50s, with graying black hair and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to see everything. She listened without interruption as Joseph explained their situation in rapid Spanish, her expression growing more serious with each detail. "You are the woman who burned Pike's office," she said to Elise, in accented but clear English. "The whole territory is talking about it. Some say you are a hero. Others say you are a dangerous criminal. I'm hoping Marshal Hartley will see it as justice," Elise replied. Carmen studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Pike has brought much suffering to good people. If you have evidence that can stop him, then you have my help." She gestured toward the stairs. "Come. You will need proper clothes and a good meal before you face the marshal. First impressions matter greatly with government men." An hour later, Elise emerged from Carmen's best room, transformed. The Mexican woman had provided her with a modest but respectable dress in dark green wool, clean undergarments, and shoes that actually fit her feet. More importantly, she had access to hot water and soap for the first time in over a week, allowing her to wash away the dust and grime of the desert journey. Carmen had also prepared the documents, pressing them flat and arranging them in a leather portfolio that looked official and important. "These papers will speak for themselves," she said, "but you must present them like a lady of education, not like a fugitive from justice." Joseph had cleaned up as well, trading his travel-stained buckskins for a simple but respectable shirt and trousers that Carmen's late husband had worn. He looked uncomfortable in the white man's clothing, but Elise knew that appearances would matter when they approached the federal authorities. "I've sent word to Marshal Hartley that a lady with important territorial business wishes to see him," Carmen reported. "He has agreed to meet with you this afternoon at 3 o'clock. The federal building was bustling with activity when they arrived, clerks and officials moving through the corridors with the purposeful efficiency of government bureaucracy. Elise felt a flutter of nervousness as they climbed the stairs to the marshal's office, knowing that everything they had risked and suffered for depended on the next hour. Marshal William Hartley was not what she had expected. He was a man in his 40s with graying brown hair and keen blue eyes, dressed in a simple but well-tailored suit rather than the frontier clothing she had anticipated. His office was lined with law books and territorial maps, and his desk was covered with neat stacks of official documents. "Miss Laurent," he said, rising to greet them with old-fashioned courtesy. "Mrs. Valdez tells me you have information regarding territorial matters that might interest federal authorities." "Yes, Marshal. Information about a criminal conspiracy involving railroad interests, territorial officials, and violations of federal treaty obligations." Elise's voice was steady despite her nervousness. "I believe these documents will speak for themselves." She opened the leather portfolio and began laying out the papers on Hartley's desk. Her father's survey maps, the territorial boundary documents, the railroad route plans, and most importantly, the pages from Pike's ledger showing his illegal financial dealings. Hartley's expression grew more serious as he examined each document, his trained eye quickly recognizing the significance of what he was seeing. He asked pointed questions about specific details, testing Elise's knowledge of the materials and her credibility as a witness. "These survey maps show proposed railroad routes through territory that was guaranteed to the Comanche by federal treaty," he said finally. "And these financial records indicate systematic bribery of local officials and fraudulent mining claims." "Yes, sir. And this shows that the entire operation was being coordinated by Thaddeus Pike of Dusty Fork, with the knowledge and participation of corrupt officials throughout the territory." Hartley leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Lauren, I have to ask, how did you come by these documents?" This was the moment Elise had been preparing for. "Mr. Pike stole them from me when I arrived in Dusty Fork. They belonged to my father, who was a cartographer for the French government and later worked with American territorial surveyors. When Pike refused to return my property, I was forced to retrieve it myself.
You broke into his office?
I recovered my stolen inheritance? Yes, sir. Hartley was quiet for several minutes, studying the documents and weighing the legal implications of what she had told him. Finally, he looked up at Joseph, who had remained silent throughout the interview.
And you, Mr. Running Bear, what is your role in this matter?
I represent the interests of my people, who stand to lose their treaty lands if this conspiracy succeeds. Joseph replied with quiet dignity. Miss Lauren's evidence proves what we have long suspected, that the railroad interests plan to take our land regardless of federal law.
I see.
Hartley turned back to Elise. Miss Lauren, what you've brought me is potentially explosive evidence of widespread corruption and federal crimes. But I have to be honest with you. Pursuing this will be dangerous for everyone involved. Pike has powerful friends, and they won't hesitate to use violence to protect their interests. Marshal, I've already lost everything I came to this territory with, my reputation, my possessions, nearly my life. But I've gained something more important, the knowledge that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, regardless of the cost.
Hartley smiled for the first time since they had arrived.
Well said, Miss Lauren. And I have to admit, it's refreshing to see someone stand up to men like Pike. He gathered the documents into a neat stack. I'm going to need detailed sworn statements from both of you, and I'll want to examine Mr. Pike's office and financial records personally.
His office burned down, Elise said quietly.
Ah, yes, I heard about that. Hartley's expression suggested he wasn't entirely surprised. Well, we'll work with what we have. These documents alone are enough to launch a federal investigation, and I suspect that investigation will uncover additional evidence. Over the next several days, Amarillo became the center of a whirlwind of federal activity. Marshal Hartley called in additional agents from regional offices, and teams of investigators spread out across the territory to gather evidence and interview witnesses. The scope of Pike's criminal enterprise proved to be even larger than Elise had imagined, involving dozens of officials and extending into multiple states. The climax came when Hartley led a federal task force to Dusty Fork, armed with warrants for Pike's arrest and the seizure of his remaining records. Pike tried to resist, but even his hired guns were no match for federal marshals backed by territorial militia. The man who had terrorized the region for years was finally brought to justice, along with most of his criminal associates. The trial, held in the federal courthouse in Amarillo, became the largest criminal proceeding in territorial history. Elise testified for 3 days, explaining the significance of her father's documents and detailing Pike's crimes. Her testimony was clear, confident, and devastating to the defense's attempts to portray Pike as a legitimate businessman. Joseph also testified, describing the impact of Pike's activities on his people and providing context for the treaty violations revealed in the documents. His quiet dignity and obvious intelligence impressed the jury and helped dispel stereotypes about Native peoples. The verdict was unanimous on all counts: conspiracy, fraud, bribery, violation of federal treaties, and a dozen other charges. Pike was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, effectively ending his criminal empire and sending a clear message that corruption would not be tolerated in the territory. In the months that followed, Elise found herself in an unexpected position. The territorial government, embarrassed by the scope of corruption that had been revealed, was eager to make reforms and needed honest, educated people to help implement them. She was offered a position as a territorial surveyor, using her father's knowledge and her own hard-won understanding of frontier politics to help establish honest, lawful development. Joseph's people also benefited from the outcome. The federal government, faced with undeniable evidence of treaty violations, renewed its commitment to honoring existing agreements and established new protections for tribal lands. Joseph himself became a liaison between the territorial government and the Comanche, helping to establish a more cooperative relationship based on mutual respect rather than force. One evening, as the sun set over the growing town of Amarillo, Elise and Joseph stood on the porch of the boarding house where their relationship had first moved from alliance to something deeper. "Do you ever regret leaving New Orleans?" Joseph asked, watching the play of colors across the western sky. Elise considered the question, thinking of the comfortable life she had left behind and comparing it to the challenges and rewards of her new existence. "No," she said finally. "I came here looking for a husband and a safe, predictable life. Instead, I found something much more valuable. The knowledge that I'm stronger than I ever imagined, and a purpose that matters." Joseph smiled and took her hand in his. "The territorial governor is planning a ceremony next month to honor those who helped expose Pike's conspiracy. They want to present you with an official commendation. Will you be there?" "If you want me to be." Elise squeezed his hand, feeling the warmth and strength that had sustained her through their dangerous journey. "I want you to be wherever I am, for as long as you'll have me." Their wedding, held in the new church that had been built with honest money rather than Pike's corruption, was attended by an unusual gathering of frontier society. Carmen Valdez served as matron of honor, while Federal Marshal Hartley walked Elise down the aisle in place of her deceased father. Comanche warriors sat alongside territorial officials. Mexican ranchers shared pews with German immigrants. And the ceremony was conducted in 3 languages to accommodate all the guests. Years later, when the story of Pike's downfall had become frontier legend, people would speak of the mail-order bride who was rejected for being too worthless, but proved that a person's true value lay not in others' opinions, but in their own courage and determination. They would tell how a Comanche warrior and a French cartographer's daughter had found love and justice in the most unlikely circumstances, transforming a lawless territory into a place where honest people could build honest lives. And in the surveyor's office in Amarillo, where Elise worked to map a better future for the growing territory, her father's instruments were displayed with pride, no longer symbols of loss and theft, but tools of justice and hope for generations to come.